Here is the solution to the try it out from 5.5. It is the proof that we had today in class. Okay, so the given is that ABCD is an isosceles trapezoid and that ABCD is a parallelogram. We're being asked to prove that triangle ADE is an isosceles triangle. So before I start with the statements and reasons, what I always do is I take this information and I process it, I break it down, and then I just mark up the diagram or the figure that's given accordingly. So the key here is isosceles trapezoid. An isosceles trapezoid is a trapezoid with one set of parallel sides, and the non-parallel sides are congruent to each other. So A, B, C, E, right, is our trapezoid. The non-parallel sides are congruent to each other, and also the angles at the bases, right, these angles here, base angles, are congruent as well, okay? So not only are these two sides congruent in an isosceles trapezoid, the two angles here, these sets of angles, are congruent, okay? So what else is important information? That ABCD is a parallelogram. So that really indicates to me that these two sides are congruent and that these two sides are congruent, okay? So marking up the diagram always helps you see very clearly the information that's going to help you write the proof. If it's something that you choose not to do, proof writing will be a little bit more difficult. If it is something that you choose to do, it will help you to make your statements, okay? So my first statement, of course, is the given information. And that is that ABCE is an isosceles trapezoid, and that ABCD is a parallelogram. That's our given information. That's what we write first, okay? And that is given. The next thing we want to write, again, it's supposed to help us really determine that triangle ADE is isosceles. So what's important here? I think what's important here is that side BC is congruent to side AD. And why is that true? BC is congruent to side AD. Why? Because in a parallelogram, opposite sides are congruent. Okay, so BC is congruent to AD. All right, so if that's the case, then what's the next statement I'm making? So I said BC is congruent to AD, and then BC is also congruent to AE. So the reason why BC is congruent to AE is because in an isosceles trapezoid, non-parallel sides are congruent. And that's the definition of an isosceles trapezoid, okay? So we're going to proceed with the rest of this proof, okay? So we stated that BC is congruent to AD and that BC is congruent to AE. So if that's the case, AD is congruent to AE. Why is that the case? Because if these two are the same size, right? If these two are the same measurement, that's what we mean by congruent, that they're the same length. So let's say BC was 4 units in length, that would mean that AD is 4 units in length. And if BC and AE are congruent, then AE is also 4 units in length. So by that same token, AD and AE have the same length, and that property is known as the transitive property. And we're going to use that same transitive property, even though we can look at triangle ADE and know that it's isosceles. I'm just going to take it a step further, and we can use that same property for the angles, right? So if I know that angle C is equal to, or rather congruent to angle E, that's because base angles in an isosceles trapezoid. Base, I just mean the 2 angles at the bottom here. Base angles in an isosceles trapezoid are congruent. Okay? So, my 6th statement is that if that's the case, so I have here base angles in an isosceles trapezoid are congruent. And then for number 6, my 6th statement, if E and C are congruent, then my next statement E and C are congruent, then my next statement is that angle E is congruent to angle D. In a triangle, if 2 angles, or rather if 2 sides are congruent, the angles opposite are also congruent. Okay, so I'm making this a nice lengthy proof, a nice meaty proof, where I'm showing what I know through the statements and reasons that I'm making. Okay, if you need me to make this a little bit bigger. All right, and then finally, my last statement is, and we do have an isosceles triangle. So triangle ADE is isosceles. And the reason for that is just the definition of an isosceles triangle, or definition of and that's that. Okay, so just to recap what was written here, and let me just bring this down a little bit. The first thing I did was I started with the given information. I marked up my diagram accordingly. I wrote the givens. Then I, based on the properties of a parallelogram, I wrote here that these 2, rather AD and BC, are congruent. Based on the properties of an isosceles trapezoid, these 2 are congruent. Based on the transitive property, I deduced that if these 2 are congruent and these 2 are congruent, then these 2 sides have to also be congruent. Then, and that's by the transitive property, and then I identified these 2 as congruent because of the properties of an isosceles trapezoid. And then, because of what I know about isosceles, or rather triangles or isosceles triangles, or triangles with 2 congruent sides, the angles that are opposite those sides are also congruent, okay? And so if that's the case, then we have an isosceles triangle. Alrighty, make sure you have this tomorrow for class. It will be checked.